Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for joining me today. My name is Greg Moore, and this presentation is exactly what the slide says here, is looking at running from the pose method perspective. And if you haven't heard of pose method, we're going to give you an introduction. Dr. Romanoff, who is the founder of the method, is probably the world's leading authority on running. And he has many books, and it's very easy to find these folks on the internet if you want more information after this presentation is over. This slide says a lot for what we're going to be going through today, and the reason I say that is because there's going to be some new material for most of you listening today, a different way of looking at things, and not just for running, by the way, for movement in general. So keep your mind open, and I think you can get a lot out of this presentation today. So we're going to look at the history of the pose method, where did it come from, how did it start. And as I alluded to earlier, it was started in 1977 by a gentleman named Dr. Nicholas Romanoff. And he was tasked with improving running performance in the Soviet Union. And he recognized that there was really, at that time anyway, there was no commonly accepted method or model for teaching running. How do you do it? So he set about to remedy that, and he did that by looking at literally thousands of runners and looked at them in a frame-by-frame analysis with video, and at the time really film. And if you think about that timing, this was a ton of work. And what he identified is something very unique. He didn't identify what's different about all the runners. Instead, he identified specifically what all the runners do the same, meaning the elements in running that are the same in every runner. And we're going to be covering these in detail. They're referred to as pose, fall, and pull. So it's an entirely new way of looking at movement and running that's really was revolutionary for me, and I'm sure you'll find it the same way as we go through this presentation. The entire system is based upon skill development. So pose teaches that the central element for all training programs should be skill development and perception. The ability to perceive and, in my language, kinesthetically become aware of and controlling different factors in a drill or in a sports skill. This is true with amateur athletes and elite athletes, and it's an area that has really, particularly in running, it's not happened. People just think that people know how to run optimally, and the fact is, for the vast majority of us, we do not run optimally, quote, naturally, innately. So he looked at movement in general, and we'll apply this to running, though. And what he noticed in movement, Dr. Romanoff, is that there are key poses or postures in every movement, whether it's throwing a football pass, hitting a golf ball, or running for that one. And that there's these postures and poses in all sports skills and movements, and that a lot of this involves the precise application of body weight. Where do you apply your body weight, and when do you unweight? And precision is the key words here, and we'll dig into this more further in the presentation. And then following that application on weighting, a deliberate action like a pull in a compound movement that initiates a change of sport. And we'll show you exactly what this means in relation to running and forward through the presentation. So here is a key example of poses or postures and each one of these immediately conveys a lot of information to any of us, as we all know, just looking at these silhouettes. So in the pose method, movement is defined as changing direction and speed of a specific object relative to the rest of the existing environment. So keep that in mind. Movement is always the result of force. And force is a magnitude of interaction between two material bodies. Sounds complicated, but we'll tie it all together. One outcome of force is acceleration. So if we apply force to something, we can potentially accelerate it. And if we look at forces, the nature of the forces, when we look at direction, how quickly they're applied, etc., really it defines the nature of the movement. So understanding forces is critical to understanding movement, obviously. So in the pose method, gravity, which is a ubiquitous force that we all experience all the time, is prioritized as the primary force for movement. And we'll talk about this more as we go through the presentation. So pose sees the forces in running in two different groups. There's two sets of forces. The first set we call gratuitous forces. What are they? there are three gratuitous forces, and gratuitous implies free. They're not quite free, but there's a very low cost to use these forces. So gravity, there is no cost for gravity. It is there. If the more we use it, the less work we have to do. There's ground reaction force. Ground reaction force, if you're not familiar with this term, is Newton's law here. We put force into something and force comes back at us. So if we put force vertically down into the ground, we're going to get force back up from the ground reaction force, in an equal and opposite direction. Muscle tendon elasticity, which is also known as the stretch shortening cycle, very important. And this is ubiquitous in human movement. And this refers to the loading of a muscle or muscle groups as they lengthen, as they stretch. We're kind of loading energy into the elastic elements and the connective tissue elements of a muscle and tendon system, and then we get a rebound as the muscle shortens. And there's kind of free energy associated with this. So when we use a rapid eccentric, it's called loading, which is when that muscle is lengthening, and follow it quickly in succession with the right timing, with a shortening of the muscle, we get a stronger contraction for less energy output than if we don't use this. Okay, so again, there's gratuitous force here because we can get more for less when we use this stretch shortening cycle properly. Then the other forces in running and in movement we define as active contractions. These are where we're really using a lot of ATP and a lot of energy. They're not gratuitous. We have to think about them, and the energy cost for this aspect of movement is relatively high. So these types of forces exist on a balance, on a scale here. You can see in an ideal world, there's a balance there. The muscle contractions are the thoughtful, active contractions and are balanced out by those other gratuitous forces, which we don't have to use much, if any, energy to access and use. Obviously, the more we use the forces on the left side, the less we have to use active muscle contractions, which is how we become more efficient in movement and also more powerful. So the more gratuitous forces that we use and can harness, if you will, we get increased mechanical efficiency. And what does that mean? It's easier. We're more economical in running, which means we can run the same distance or the same speed with less energy output, just like an economical car uses less gas to go the same distance as a non-economical one. So we want to use more of those external forces like gravity and less of those active conscious muscular efforts, the non-stretch shortening cycle concentric focused efforts. And concentric contractions, if you don't know, are just when the muscle is shortening. And they're what we're most of us familiar with and think of in athletics. But that stretch shortening cycle is more important than that. And the more we can utilize that, the more we can save energy for when we have to use it. So in order to use these forces, though, here's the catch. The athlete needs strength and stability to avoid injury and to have the ability to redirect forces like gravity, which is really what running is all about. So this is a diagram called the transformation of energy, and it's a hierarchy, as you can see. So on the top of it is gravity. You know, gravity is a ubiquitous acceleration force. So gravity accelerates or attempts to pull down any object in its field at 9.81 meters per second squared. So it's a very strong force, even though we take it for granted. It's constant, and it is a source of acceleration. As I just said, if I drop an object from a height, in the first second it will fall 9.81 meters. Okay, in the second second it will be 9.81 meters times 9.81 in the same second. It is accelerating, so gravity is an acceleration force. Everything we do on Earth is a derivative of gravity. There is no force production without gravity. If you don't believe me, think about that for a second. So in fact, in a low gravity environment, like say the moon, muscles do not work well at all. You can't run quickly on the moon. You'd think, intuitively, well, I'd run faster because there's no gravity. You need gravity for muscles to work. If you look at the higher, there's gravity. Without gravity, your body really, it creates weight. Without gravity, there is no weight. So body mass is ubiquitous, is the same thing as weight on the Earth. And as soon as we have weight, we need to support it, right? And the support of it becomes, in fact, our body weight. And applying our body weight is how we apply muscle effort. Without having weight, without having gravity, we cannot apply force to anything. We need a base of support. So the muscles work to change support, and this causes movement. If this is unclear to you, I think it'll become more clear as we go through the rotation. So strength development, when we're looking at the pose model of running, Dr. Romanoff recognizes, the pose method recognizes the body in running has to absorb 3 to 5 times your body weight on one leg, and it has to do it over and over again. This is a big deal. This means that strength development is a major priority. You must be strong to run well. In order to run faster, you must get even stronger. So being strong and strength training for running before you start running is really, really important. However, when we look at strength from a pose perspective, strength does not so much create horizontal movement across the ground. What it does is it allows the athlete to change the direction and speed of movement, but that movement is initiated by the gratuitous force of gravity. Remember that and really keep that in mind as we move forward through the presentation. So in the pose method, there's a specific teaching model that is simple and elegant. First of all, pose is the only running model where there is really an extremely well-defined standard for running. You know, once you've learned the pose method, which is not that complex in its essence, you understand that there's a specific standard of what everyone should be doing to optimize their running. And then, of course, there are deviations from this standard. People are not perfect when they run. And pose has broken down the standard into 3 elements. The pose, we'll cover this later, and there are common deviations in this element. For example, a common deviation from the standard is that people arrive too late into the pose position in the running cycle. And we'll be taking a look at this. The fall, which is another element of running and another element part of the standard. A deviation in the fall portion is instead of falling, people bend at the waist. So they're not falling forward, or when they run with their legs only, which is for what happens, for example, on a treadmill, which we'll be taking a look at. And then the last key element in running that Dr. Romanoff has identified is the pull. And the common deviations for this are fully extending the trail leg. We'll be looking at this closely. And what that indicates is a late pull, and a late pull throws the cycle off of running, the cycle of pose, fall, pull. And very often this occurs because the cadence of the individual running is not fast enough. And again, we'll talk more about that as we get into it. So some of the concepts to understand about from the pose method perspective is that all forces, and we said this before, on Earth are derivatives of gravity. They're from gravity. Without gravity, there are no forces. And so pose looks at the role of those forces in movement and then teaches you that and then gives you a specific action cue on how to best achieve what you want to achieve. So, for example, in running, one of the most important action cues is to try to perceive that you're pulling your foot off the ground before you actually land on it. Now, obviously, this is impossible. Don't worry. You'll never actually do it. Your body won't let you do that. What does this cause in terms of that focus? What does this create within the runner? Well, it really allows you to create a more loaded spring mechanism in your leg. Remember, we talked about stretch shortening cycle, which maximizes the effectiveness of the stretch shortening cycle. So we get a better rebound with less active muscle effort if we use this action cue when we run. So the 3 components, again, of running and that are present in all runners, everybody does these 3 components, is the pose, you see that in 1, the fall, where we literally fall as a unit forward, and the pull, where we're pulling that heel off the ground directly under the hip. These are non-variable essential elements. They occur in every person. So a key to improving running form is increasing the runner's perception, their ability to perceive, kinesthetically be aware of and control the pose. Are they in the pose? Are they in the correct position? The fall and the pull. And then By doing so, as you gain perception of these elements, you can improve the timing of these three elements in relation to one another. And that is what great running is all about. So when we look at the running pose, it's a whole body pose. We're vertically aligned, the shoulders, hips, and ankles on the support leg while standing on the ball of the foot. And we're in an S-like shape of the body. We're straight, but there's a natural curves to the body, like the lumbar curve of the spine, that are supposed to be there. And when we're aligned properly in the pose, we're in a position to absorb energy, and we're creating a position that we can collect potential energy as we land and store energy as the muscles elongate, as there's slight flexion at the ankle, knee, and hip, and we store energy, which we then use immediately afterwards as we extend slightly to lift the center of gravity back up after we land. The support foot, and then once we're in that pose, all we got to do is fall from it. It takes no active effort. We fall. What does the movement? Gravity pulls us forward. The support foot is then pulled from the ground at the end of the support phase, at the end of the fall, and then we let the other foot drop down to catch us. That's running. And here's another picture of the running pose and that S-like posture. If we really look at this carefully, what we notice is there's alignment from the ball of the foot all the way up here, as you can see with my cursor going up and down, right? We're not bent at the waist. So there's an S-like curve to the body, but there's also a natural alignment, and maintaining this alignment takes strength and stability and is crucial for maximizing running efficiency. So the running pose we just talked about, it's also called mid-stance in a lot of running literatures. All runners go through this position in some variation. It's unavoidable. You have to go through this position. There are no exceptions, and you'll see it anytime you video someone and run it by in slow motion. You'll see them pass through that posture. This is the fundamental position of power and potential energy. Again, I'm repeating what I said before. We reload the muscles eccentrically, which means as they lengthen, and that is the beginning of the stretch shortening cycle. We store energy in that connective tissue as we lengthen the muscles and tendons, and then we reclaim it automatically as the muscle rebounds, kind of like a rubber band. So one of the key principles here is time on support, which is also known as the time in the pose. Because time in support is when your foot's on the ground. The shorter that time is, the fewer injuries that we have and the higher your speed. Conversely, the longer we spend on the ground, the more injuries we have and the slower we go. And we'll dig into this more and more. But this is absolutely an unarguable principle of improving efficiency and speed and performance running. So we talked about the pose position, and what really differs in different runners is how they get to that pose position. So as I look at this diagram, there are three different runners landing in three different places: heel, midfoot, and forefoot. And we'll look at this further as we move forward. Okay, so most of the injuries in running are going to occur when we reach out ahead of the body. The worst position is either land on the heel, or even as we see here in the second one, the middle man here, even when we land on the midfoot, and we're going to dig into that term more, we still are getting lots of load. We're also decelerating whenever we reach out ahead of the body. So what we want to do is land on that forefoot. We want to land on the ball of the foot, not the midfoot, the ball of the foot, not the toes, not the heel. And this is very, very important. And we want to land, as we see this silhouette here, we want to land as close to possible as vertical here. So this landing that's being illustrated is very close to vertical. The foot is very slightly out ahead, but what's going to happen as soon as this guy lands, he immediately, boom, in a heartbeat, he's in that pose stance. Remember, we want to get in and out of the pose as quickly as possible for running efficiency and performance. So if we want to prevent injuries, we got to focus, as we see here, on landing on that forefoot as close to directly underneath the hips as possible. And nobody can land perfectly, but we want to get as close as we can. That's one of our key goals. So the primary goal with any skillful activity is to avoid getting injured, right? That's the first thing. Don't get hurt. Most injuries occur from contact to pose. when we're on the ground. People aren't getting hurt in the air. They're getting hurt in their interaction with the ground. The further ahead of the body the foot lands, the longer the support time, which means the longer run support we expose the joints, ligaments, and tendons to excessive amounts of load. We want to be on and off loading. The quicker we can get in and out of the pose position, the fewer injuries we'll have, and the faster we run. So heel striking, let's dig into that a little bit more directly. Very critical of that. Why? We tend to lock the joints, as is illustrated in this picture. When we have locked joints and we land on the heels, we have no ability to use our muscles as shock absorbers, which means what? All the joint structures from the heel all the way up through the knee, hip, and back are going to get loaded, and just pick one to get injured. The most common offender where we get injured is the knee, but any of them can get injured. Up to 3 times our body weight is absorbed by the joints in this thing. Something to think. There's the longest support time. When I land on the heel like this, I've got to travel from this position all the way over the top before I get to the pose, and I've got to go through the pose before I can take my next step. So it elongates, it makes longer support time, which is exactly what we don't want to do. We're also more prone to supination and pronation of the foot because of the position we're in here. When we have too much supination or pronation, we get injuries from that as well. So midfoot is another goal, landing on the midfoot. We're very critical, or pose is very critical of this concept for several good reasons. One, there really are a lot of different definitions of what midfoot is. The current most accepted definition is landing on your midfoot is defined as landing on your forefoot, or the ball of the foot, and the heel at exactly the same time. Now, as this says, there's a consistency issue. How often can someone repeatedly land with both of those points at the same time? The answer, they're not, which means, in effect, they're landing on the ball of the foot sometimes, then the heel sometimes. So there's no consistency. There's also, because the foot is still in front of the body too much, there's excessive leverage on the knee. There's the same eccentric knee load as we land as a heel strike. So it's really not a whole lot better than the heel strike. And also, we still get that braking deceleration effect every time we land if we do a, quote, mid-landing. And the other problem with the concept of midfoot is here are 4 different ways that midfoot is described in the running scientific literature. Meaning, one guy has this definition, another guy has this one, another guy, this is the most accepted one, and pose would say this. But really, trying to land on it, regardless of what your definition is, again, not a practical or an optimal solution in running, not something you really want to do. So when you hear people saying that, there's just not a lot of basis for making that the basis of a running model. Forefoot strike, or landing on the ball of the foot, that's what we really want here. When we do that properly, we can reduce the load to the knee by 50%. So that's obviously a critical goal. We use the stretch shortening cycle most effectively and naturally when we land on the ball of the foot. And just jump up and down in place quickly, and you'll feel this immediately. Shortest support time. If we land on the ball of the foot, we can get on and off support, which is to say in and out of the pose position or runner stance, more quickly than landing anywhere else. It's also the most efficient way to run. So if we look at this graph of ground reaction force, and remember again, ground reaction forces are forces that are coming back up at you from the force you're delivering into the ground, okay? And if we look at, and these are vertical ground reaction forces. We'll talk about horizontal and lateral ground reaction force a little bit later. But notice in the heel strike, there's a double hitch there on the top graph. You can see that. Why is that? Because the heel hits and then the body weight. So we're really giving ourselves more impact, more trauma to the joints because we've got to come from this position and roll forward to this position. So we get that double strike there. And this is, you can actually see this displayed and what happens. Whereas this is what the ground reaction forces look like if we land on the ball of the foot. Falling. Great. I'll let you read this and I'll read through it with you. This is by Leonardo da Vinci, but it really says a lot that this brilliant gentleman recognized this a long time ago. Motion is created by the destruction of balance, that is, of equality of weight, for nothing can move by itself. Really important to get this, which does not leave its state of balance, meaning you can't move in a balanced position, because if you're in balance, you won't move. And that thing which moves most rapidly, which is furthest from its balance of the motion and course of animals, that figure will appear swiftest in its course, which is about to fall forward. He recognized a long time ago what Dr. Romanoff is saying, which is correct, which is that movement is about falling. Real important to get that. Fall. So let's dig into the fall a little bit. Pose postulates that what separates elite athletes from amateur runners is fall angle. And we'll depict this in a moment. But suffice to say, the bigger the angle of fall, the faster you run. Gravity, remember, as I said before, is going to accelerate a falling object at 9.81 meters per second squared. Now, we're not falling straight down, we're falling in anger. So when we're running, we can use a fractional percentage of this acceleration based on the fall angle. The higher the fall angle, the faster we move, up to a point. So falling is responsible for acceleration. We can fall from between 0 to a maximum of 22.5 degrees. We can't fall any further than 22.5 degrees, or we will in fact fall on our face. And there's a very detailed explanation in this in Dr. Romanoff's book that would take quite some time to explain. But the physics of this are pretty undeniable when you take the time to walk through this. So what's the takeaway here? The greater the fall angle, the faster we run. Falling, and this is super important, is not bending at the waist. The body must stay aligned in a straight line when we're falling. Big mistake is to break at the waist, and lots of people do it. So, as you can see here in this picture, here's where he was in the pose. Then he lets his hips fall forward, right? Keeping everything on top aligned with his hips. This creates acceleration. If he fell further, he would run faster. So harnessing gravity by falling from the pose position is like harnessing the wind in a sail. It's the key to running faster. It's very important. The fall is the most important. So let's talk about arms, because a lot of people say, well, you've got to pump your arms to run faster. And let's talk about how Pose views this. Dr. Romanoff is. Most people, if you run in place and teach someone how to run in place properly, which is a lot easier than running, I might add, most people can get great arm drive. They can move those arms and legs in sync really, really fast and have a super high cadence. But yet, if you watch that person run, they don't run that fast. So if it was just as easy as swinging your arms fast, everyone would be able to run fast. So arms by themselves are not going to help you run fast, and this emphasis on them to the exclusion of other elements, it's not the place to focus most of our time and effort. Arm movement must, in fact, stay in sync with leg movement, and the reason you swing the arms is to balance, right? You have to, just like you do automatically when you walk. So it's important, but it's not the key factor. So things like swinging your arms in sync with the movement of your lower body and using a shorter lever, meaning not a straight arm, they're absolutely factors in running, but they are far from the most important. The most important thing to running faster is fall angle. Absolutely angle. So now let's talk about two other concepts that are important to understand in running, and that is stride length and range of motion. So stride length, as depicted here, is the distance between 2 points of landing. His foot landed somewhere here, probably, because he's in the air here, right? And then the other foot lands here. That distance is stride length. Now let's talk about range of motion, which appears to be the same thing, but it is not the same thing. Range of motion refers to the angular displacement between his front and back legs. So I don't know, let's say that's 40 degrees. Doesn't really matter what the number with, but there's some number associated with range of motion from front leg to the rear leg. Something really important to recognize is the third bullet here. Stride length automatically increases with increased running speed, even without an increased range of motion. In other words, even if I keep this angular displacement in each stride exactly the same, as I accelerate my center of mass and move faster horizontally, what's going to happen? I'm going to have a longer stride length. How can that happen? Because I move farther when I'm in the air. Make sure you understand this concept. Very important. So in the fourth bullet, when we tell athletes to focus on deliberately increasing stride length, this is a really, really bad idea. Because what the outcome of that, more often than not, when I tell you to increase your stride length, is you reach ahead with the foot. When you reach ahead of the foot, you throw your timing off, and the biggest thing you do, we know the farther ahead of the body that the foot lands, the more trauma to the leg, and the more decelerating we're doing. So it's a really bad idea to try to increase stride length. Last bullet, important to understand. Pose looks at stride length as an outcome of increased speed, not the cause of it. So yes, the faster you run, the longer your stride length. But the stride length doesn't cause the running speed. Stride length is an outcome of increased horizontal speed. Really important that as well. Cadence in running speed. The other factor in running speed is cadence. Like stride length, there is a relationship between running speed and cadence. However, cadence and stride length increase as running speed increases. They're not the cause of higher running speed, but rather an outcome of higher running speed, which comes from fall angle. This is important because 99% of the people think, well, if I just speed up my cadence and/or I increase my stride length, I will automatically run faster. No, because what they're missing is that stride length and cadence don't cause running speed. They're an outcome of speed, and the speed comes from what? Fall angle. Really important to get this. So when someone's running optimally, cadence and stride length will increase in response to increased fall angle automatically. The pull, the last element we talked about, pose, fall, and pull, is pulling. As the arrow shows, pulling means literally using the hamstrings, pulling that heel right underneath the butt. Not pulling it back here, not pulling it here, right underneath the butt. Deliberate, quick action. Very important. So the pull. In pose, the pull is the main active element, if you recall me saying this before. Falling is passive. It does not require you to do anything. It is gratuitous. It is free energy. All you have to do is keep the body aligned. Landing, done properly, is reflexive. You don't have to focus on that. If you land on the ball of the foot, SSC is stretch shortening cycle. The body knows how, in the correct position, with slight flexion of the ankle, knee, and hip, you will absorb and then recover. And this is very simple to learn. It's natural. It's been part of human movement for thousands of years. It's not something you want to think through. We pull at the end of the fall to recover the pose position, and then we repeat the process again. Pose, fall, pull. Okay, the pull, is where active muscle efforts play the greatest role. So this is where we do have to use active muscle fall, which is one of the reasons why conditioning the hamstring is so important for running and so important in pose running. Now, how high we pull the foot under the hips is determined by our fall angle. And remember, fall angle determines speed. So at higher speed, we're going to have to do a higher, faster pull. And when things are working, this kind of normally happens. So if we're jogging slowly, the pull is going to be low. Right? It doesn't have to be as quick because we're not moving as quickly. If we're sprinting, we're going to have to get that foot off the ground very fast, and we're going to have to pull it hard and fast and high to stay in balance. Push off. So the whole idea of push off, so this is what people see. They don't think of it as pulling, they think of it as pushing. This position is associated in people's minds with push-off, and it certainly wasn't mine until I met Dr. Romanoff and learned to understand the physics of this. The fact is, you're not pushing off when you run. The premise of pushing is that using the muscles in the trail leg, this runner will push off the ground, and that is what propels the body forward. The main caveat, and I think everyone will be able to see this quickly, is maximum push-off, even if you're trying to push off, can be in the vertical direction, right? In this position, if I apply force, where is almost all my force going? And the answer is it's going down. If I'm pushing down into the ground, ground reaction forces are equal and opposite. So in what direction does that send me? It sends me in this direction. It does almost nothing to move me horizontally. So the push-off, which doesn't really exist in the way that people understand it, is not the primary driving horizontal force. Big deal to understand that. So then here he's beginning to unweight. Here he has completely unweighted the foot. And then there, corresponding to this, there are three different graphs we're looking at. The Z here is horizontal ground reaction forces. So forces coming from the ground up into our body. The x-axis is the lateral. So there are lateral left and right forces, and it's showing what's happening with those. They're not really super important for the purposes of this discussion. And then the y-axis here is showing forward and backward forces. Like where the forces coming out of the ground, some vector or direction of those forces are heading either backwards or forwards. So as we look at this, there's a key point that Dr. Romanoff has highlighted in this slide. So remember, we're starting to unweight. So here's the vertical forces. The ground reaction force at this moment in time, between this point and this point, is equal to one body weight. So the force that is coming off the ground, remember that, the force coming off the ground is equal to the force that we put into the ground, is exactly body weight at this point in the stride, okay? Between this instant and this instant. Then what happens immediately after this point is, look what's happening to the forces. They're dropping away to zero, okay? So at this point in time, there are no forces vertically coming up into the foot of the person. Then look at what happens here with the forward directional forces in ground reaction force. At the same moment in time that the ground vertical forces, the forces pushing up, are equal to one body weight, we have maximized our forward propelling forces, okay? And that's occurred at this instance. Then at this instant, when that leg is straightening, that typical runner stance we all associated with push-off, what's happened at this point? There's like zero force in the ground here, right? And our forward forces are dropping off at this point in time. So what does this correspond with? And this corresponds with the end of the fall right here. The pull happens here, and the reason it happens here is because your body is smarter than your mind is, and it understands and is programmed from evolution and from its experience with gravity at this point in time when it no longer senses upward force from the ground. It is off support, which means what is about to happen if you don't pull this foot? And the answer is you're going to fall. You're going to physically fall. So it yanks this foot up automatically and then drops that one down. Now, what most people do wrong is they're a little bit late with this pull. And when we're late with this pull, we have to reach ahead of the body. And we'll talk about that more as we move forward. So this is another piece of science to illustrate that the push-off doesn't really occur in the way that people think. In 1990, a study was done to test the level of muscle activity in the extensor muscles at the moment the trail leg would be used to push off the ground. The results indicated unequivocally that at the particular moment, the extensor muscles were completely inactive. We'll take a look at that. So we're looking at stride here, we're landing, and we're looking at muscle activity, right? So there's very little muscle activity in the quadriceps. They're the ones that extend the knee. Now, as we're really getting in landing, what happens? They're activated here. But look back here, right when you think that they're going to be most active during the push-off, what is this showing? There's no activity. You're not pushing off. As we illustrated in the previous slide, what's happening is you've finished the fall somewhere in here, and there's no weight on this foot. You're starting to pull it. So that's what's going on here. So there really isn't a pull in the classic understanding. There's not a conscious push, and trying to push off is not going to help you. It's not a productive strategy for running efficiency, performance, or speed. Another study, independent. By the way, there's a lot of independent science on this. That last study was not Dr. Romanoff or Poe's. It was a completely independent study. You'll see a bibliography at the end of this presentation if you want to look at the work cited. So this study, here's a quote directly from it. Higher acceleration during running is mainly attained by applying similar forces to the ground at greater forward leans. We could also say forward falls, and not by simply applying greater forces. So what this study is saying is it's applying similar forces, meaning one person can run faster than the other person, but he's not applying more force to the ground, and his ability to run faster is based upon what? A greater forward lean. That's the same thing as saying fall angle. The reason for the low resultant ground reaction forces during acceleration is the dominant vertical force component, which will become detrimental when greater forces. What he's saying here, if you don't understand this, is if you try to put more force into the ground, most of the force will go down, which sends your body up. Sending your body up does not help you run forward. Does not help you run forward. Subjects with superior acceleration performance place the foot further posterior relative to the center of mass at initial contact. What does that mean? Their foot was closer to the center of mass. In other words, they were at a higher angle. So this is another study by an independent person illustrating that fall angle is the determinant of speed, not push-off. So Pistons Analogy can be helpful to kind of understand this. One of the common errors in running is to reach for landing with the swing leg. This is a really big mistake. Do not focus on landing. Do not focus. Do not think about. Do not cue people to extend stride because they will reach forward. We reach forward, we decelerate, and we create injury. Another error is focusing on pounding the feet in the ground. Everybody, as some of the best running coaches, some of the most famous running coaches say, we need to put more power in the ground. So if that's the case, then if I push more into the ground, that'll make me go faster. Well, as we've seen, that's not really the case. Instead of focusing on pounding in the ground, focus on pulling the foot from the ground to under the hip, since you must pull the support foot first. You cannot, and no one in fact does, drop the support leg before, you can't drop the swing leg, the leg that's moving forward, before you pull the stance leg from the ground. Let me say that again. You cannot drop the swing leg, the leg that's swinging in the air forward. You can't drop the foot to the ground until you've pulled the stance leg. And there are no exceptions, and I challenge anyone to show a video of someone doing it. That's not what happens when you're running. So you want to think of your legs as pistons with an inverse relationship, but this is the relationship. Before one leg can land, as I say in this final bullet, the support leg must come off the ground. So pulling the support leg is the initiator of the action, not dropping the other foot. Cadence and the pull. Cadence is very important in running, and a minimum cadence for us to effectively use that stress shortening cycle is 180 steps per minute. If we have a slow cadence, say, let's be dramatic, let's say it's 120. What that means is we're spending more time on support, and in order to get that elastic rebound from the stretch shortening cycle, I have to load as the muscles lengthen. That's my body going into flexion at the ankle, knee, and hip. And then I have to unload, which is to say I have to do a little bit of extension at the ankle, knee, and hip. And if that doesn't happen quickly, I don't get to use the stored energy. So if my cadence is not a minimum of 180, I'm not getting the benefit of the gratuitous forces generated from the stretch shortening cycle. So what does it mean? Most people are at a cadence of 160. We need to change that cadence up to 180 or higher. And doing some drills, deliberately focusing on that, is an important part of getting a runner to run properly. So most runners have a cadence that is too slow. So the strategy for increasing cadence is to focus on the pull, not trying to push faster, trying to pull that foot off the ground quickly, and then pull the other one. Pull, pull, pull. It's easy to pull the foot. It's not a lot of weight. You're just quickly pulling with a hamstring. And what we find in studies that looked at using the pose method, where we changed the cadence and focused on the pull, is that after a 12-week period of adaptation, and this is very important, initially it'll feel horrible. It's new. The rate of perceived exertion will be much higher initially because it is new to the runner. But if we practice this for 12 weeks, what did we notice in the study? We had an up to a 50% increase in mechanical efficiency and a 20% decrease in oxygen consumption. Guys, that's huge. That proves that after the adaptive period, what's happened with individuals who run this way, they use less energy to run at the same speed or distance. What does that mean? They are more efficient. An efficient car burns less gas, right? If it takes less energy to run the same speed, it gives you the ability to do two different things. You can either run much faster or you can run longer. Both of which people, that's what performance is all about. It's either running faster or farther or both. So this is how we improve running performance. No active push-off in running. Can't emphasize that enough because everyone thinks there's one. Ground reaction forces, which everyone tends to focus on as the driver for movement, they are real. They are involved in running, and Dr. Romanoff would certainly never deny that. What do they do then in running if they don't propel you forward? They provide vertical support. If there was no force coming off the ground, you fall. At the end of the fall, when the body senses that there's no forces coming up, it pulls the foot because it knows better than you consciously that if it doesn't have that vertical force coming up, what's going to happen? There's nothing holding you up. You're going to fall. So ground reaction forces hold you up vertically, and they allow you to fall through a usable range from 0 to 22.5 degrees without slipping. They keep that foot on the ground as your body pivots around it. What else do they do? Ground reaction force is the same for faster runners as for slower runners. And you'll see that in that study cited there at the same lean angles, right? So faster runners just fall through a greater range. So one thing that's important to understand is the fall angle is important, but it's important that each time you land, at the moment that you go through pose position, you're vertically oriented and not already starting to fall, because if you've already begun to fall, you have a lower fall distance. So great runners always land with each stride so that as they pass through the pose, their body is in a perfectly vertical position, then they fall from a vertical position. If you are inclined forward, say you go through the pose at 5 degrees forward and fall to 15, the distance you fell was 10 degrees versus 15, which means you get less acceleration during the fall. The other thing to keep in mind is maximum horizontal acceleration. The maximum horizontal acceleration during running occurs before peak posterior ground reaction. So before you get the peak push from the ground, you're already moving fast. That's because the peak, there is some push up from the ground, and a little bit of it helps you move forward. Again, the peak thing here is what? It's fall. Fall is the driver of horizontal movement. Another thing that people focus on related to this idea of push-off is pawing back, dragging and pulling the foot through the ground to move me forward, as if I can pull myself forward. The reality is no amount of muscular effort can pull the body forward faster than the momentum of the body. Instead of focusing on swinging the leg, we focus on pulling the foot. So that foot we've been focused on pulling it under the hips before it hits the ground. What this does is it shortens the lever, allowing much less energy to pull the leg forward. A shorter leg is easier to pull forward. Now, the hip flexor, is it active? Yes, it is active when the leg was stretched out here. As the body passes over and we fall, the hip flexor is stretched. Then we use what? The stretch shortening cycle, and the hip flexors help swing that leg forward. But we don't need to consciously work on it. We need to think about pulling the heel under the hips, not driving the knee forward. That's a waste. This video is a great video, and I'll let it speak for itself. Watch this. This is Dr. Romanoff running on ice, and it's pretty amazing to watch this video. So what's this all about? Well, if you can push off, and you are pushing off, think about how it would be possible to push off on ice. Because what happens on ice if you push off and any of your push off is angled to the rear? What happens to your foot? It slips. So as you can see, Dr. Romanoff has no problem running on ice, and there's no way he could be pushing off. So running, again, it's important to put this to bed, there is no real push off in running. Starting blocks. Another thing that confuses people is they look at starting blocks and they say, well, that may be true when you're running, but when you're pushing out of the starting blocks, you must be pushing. So as we go through the next slide, let's assume, just for argument's sake, that each point of contact as someone is on the starting block has about a quarter of the weight. Whether or not this is true is not the point. Just stay with me here. So let's assume that in this picture, each of his hands and each of his feet have 25% of his body weight. And let's move forward and see what happens. Ready, set, go. In one instance, he's going to pick up his hands. Now, as soon as he picks up his hands, where does his body weight go in that instance? There's no weight on his hand. Where does it have to go? There's only one place. His weight is going to, more of his weight is going to move into his feet. Now, if I look at a force graph, what am I going to see? I'm going to see that I'm going to see more force into those two things. Does that mean he's pushing off? No, it means that he picked his hands up, and if he picks his hands up, the same weight has to go where? Into his feet. That does not prove he is pushing off. So he just pulled his hands up here in this one. If we look at this, all his weight, when he pulled his hands up, has to go where? It has to go here. First step out of the block. So what happens? The back leg begins to move forward into position for our first step. All the body weight is concentrated on one leg, right? Our hands are up. We pick the other leg. So what is this going to do if we look at the force on that particular leg, on that particular block? It's going to go up. So everyone says, see, he's pushing off. No. All it means is he's only got one point of contact, which is supporting what? His entire body weight. Now, the other thing going on here, as we start to swing our rear leg forward to catch our body, your leg represents 20% of our body mass, more or less. As it's rotating at the hip and we swing it forward, it's going to do what? It's going to generate an equal and opposite reaction where we're going to get pushed back. So our general center of mass actually gets pushed back from swinging the leg forward. So from swinging the leg forward and only having one point of contact, we're automatically going to see an increase in force in that one remaining block where the foot is. That does not mean that we are pushing off. Really, really, really important to understand this. Okay, and that's in this position. So again, let's summarize. He has taken both his hands and one of his foot up. Just by picking them up, there's going to be more weight in this position, regardless of whether he is, quote, pushing off. Also, as he swings that leg forward, automatically there's going to be more force, because as you swing one forward, and this is why we swing our arms in opposition, what happens? We get some force moving back on the other side. So yes, the forces are going up in here. Does that mean that he is, quote, pushing off? And the answer is no. Here he is extending again, but if we look at this with a different understanding, we understand at this moment, at this moment in time, what does he have to start moving? He's pulling that leg, because if he doesn't pull it, he's going to do what? He's going to fall on his face. Here he goes. He's pulling it to catch himself. There he goes. Angled. And there, if you look at the entire sequence, you can get a sense of what's really going on. But again, it's all about your preconceptions as you look at the same information. I hope you're beginning to embrace the pose model and understand there's a different way that's very valid to view what's happening in movement and in running in particular. So in conclusion, all the preceding factors contribute to an increase in the force reaction graph out of the starting blocks. Not necessarily the presence of an active push-off in the way that you might traditionally think about it. So what Pose contends, what Dr. Romanoff contends, is that what the athlete really needs to focus on is pulling the rear leg forward to catch his falling body, and that the increased fall angle, remember he's at a very high angle, not a better pushing position, results in greater horizontal speed. That's what's going on. So let's start taking a look at a stride. the different possibilities in the stride. Here we have a heel striker, right? We're going to get trauma and forces into the knee and up the kinetic chain whenever we land this way. We've got a locked ankle, knee, and hip joints. More impact with every stance. We land this way. You have a mid-foot strike. Okay, little bit better perhaps, but we still have the foot way out in front of the body, so we've got leverage on the joints, particularly the knee, and we're decelerating as that foot hits because it's out in front of us. Okay, landing ahead of the body, leverage on knee, strains. Flat foot landing, because that's what a midfoot is. How can we consistently do that? And the answer is we probably can't do that consistently, so it's not a strategy for a running model and training people to run. It's also not the optimal position. Our body's designed to land and push off the ball of foot. All you have to do is jump in place, and you'll see that 99% of the people automatically land on the ball of foot because they intuitively, if they don't consciously understand, that that's how they absorb forces optimally. Forefoot strike, that's where I want to be, right? Landing there. Unlocked. So now we can flex at the ankle, knee, and hip slightly. The muscles around those joints are absorbing force. There's a minimal braking effect because I'm very close to vertical. Minimal joint strain as well. So we go from the forefoot position to the pose. So we almost immediately fall forward. Most efficient transfer of the body weight forward to the running pose. Facilitates acceleration v rotation, meaning I'm rotating around to the point of my foot, the ball of the foot on the ground. Look at the body as a falling stick as a model, and you begin to understand what's really happening in running. Proper alignment is crucial, as we mentioned. The S shape, the natural S shape of the body, flex in the ankle, knee, and hip, natural curves of the spine, but keeping the body in alignment. My body's designed to absorb force when it's in this position. It can do so very efficiently, minimizing joint trauma when I do this properly. Falling, we increase the angle, right, as we fall forward. There's that angle. The degree of falling determines my running speed. Falling in the pose is the most efficient way to run faster. Moving the swing leg forward actually slows you down. So moving that, whipping that knee forward actually drives, the right knee forward drives the left back. So trying to whip it forward is not the solution to running faster. Pumping of arms does not directly contribute to forward movement, as we discussed before. So running faster is about fun, guys. That's what it's about. And the last step, of course, is pulling. Pulling is pulling that foot in this line directly underneath as we pass off support. That's pose. And we want to keep a higher cadence because that's going to increase the efficiency by making better use of the stretch shortening cycle, which means I get less energy to run by doing that. And again, that requires some adaptation, but after a 12-week period, my body's used to it. I'm going to run with more efficiency at any speed, and that's a good thing. That's what we want. So on average, runners must increase their cadence by about 15 steps per minute to begin to do this because most people are running at 160, 165 steps a minute instead of that 180 and up where we want to be. Magnitude of the pulling action, how far I pull that high is related by the angle of falling. The higher the angle of fall, the higher the speed, the higher the speed, the higher and faster I have to do the pull. So if I want to run longer, focus on that quick cadence. Very, very important. So let's take a look at all this in a quicker way with a real runner. So this person is in the pose, as you can see. He's in the pose position. Body's in a perfect S-leg position. He's pretty darn vertical, which is where I mean, because he is vertical, he's going to get the benefit of the full fall. If he was passing through the pose position and his body was angled here, he'd get less of a fall distance, less of a fall angle. If he's falling through a less of a distance, he has less acceleration. So remember, we want to maintain that vertical alignment as we pass those. Okay, now he's fallen forward, right? Here's where he was in the pose. This fall is what's creating what? It's what's creating the forward movement. And what's already happened from here to here? He's landed and he's rebounded. Look at the heel. The heel's up more because he's naturally used that stretch shortening cycle to go down, and then his center of gravity is up again, and he's completing his fall here. actually is completing his fall here. So at this position, he started to fall. This is the end of his fall. By this time, he is off support. There is nothing going into the ground. So what is he initiating? He's starting to pull that foot from the ground. Notice his leg is not locked. Very good running form. So some facts about Usain Bolt, one of the best runners to illustrate all this. So, I'll let you read through this. Obviously, a very fast 100. His maximum falling angle was near the potential maximum, 21.5. There's also people, though, that had a higher fall angle. And the reason, how come he's running faster if he doesn't have the highest fall angle, is because he's got some advantages, genetic advantages, which are very real in running. We don't want to get into them too much, but he's taller. And yes, leg length, assuming a bunch of other things, does allow you to run faster, assuming you have the strength to utilize it, which he obviously does. His cadence in the world record was 257 steps per minute. So and it could go up even higher. So what does this tell us? He actually has room to improve. He has room to improve. And if you talk to Dr. Romanoff in depth, who really can walk you through the physics of this, what you understand is he has the potential to run much faster if he focuses on the right thing. As you can see in the bottom, he's got some advantages, which is why, even though he's not absolutely optimum, and no one is, of course, he runs so fast. He's nearly perfect, and he's also got great genetics. Not going to run fast. So let's take a look at him. Here's what's happening. He's getting ready to land here, right? And where is he reaching out for that ground? Foot landing. He lands, and then what happens? He lands almost in that pose. So if we look at this again, he lands, and then boom, in like a nanosecond, he's into that pose. He's vertically aligned, so he can take advantage of the fall. Boom. Next one, what's happened? He's falling. He's starting to fall, right? And then what's happening here? He's beginning the pull. So, forefoot contact, pose position, fall, pull. There's Usain Bolt. As you can see, he is a poster child for pose, even though he would tell you that he does not, quote, do pose. What I would tell you is to understand that gifted athletes who are naturally talented don't necessarily think about, understand exactly what they're doing. They do it. If you ask a cheetah why it's fast, obviously he doesn't know why. He's fast because he's a cheetah. So Usain Bolt's speed comes from a number of things, one of which is tremendous genetic capability, or he'd never reach that level. Even myself, if I optimize my running form to this level, I would still never touch him. I just don't have the genetic capacity to do some of the things he does in terms of my neuromuscular system. So pose also teaches a video analysis system, which is extremely easy to learn. And I'm not going to try to teach that here, just suffice it to show you. There's great apps out there. One is called UberSense. You can get UberSense in the Apple app. It's a free app, UberSense, or you can use one called Coach's Eye for Android. You really want a camera that shoots 30 to 60 frames per second to do this properly. And you can see that there's an absolute model for running in pose. It's not some kind of sort of. We know exactly where the standard is. We know exactly how to analyze. So we can then, after we analyze, we know where the issues are. And then the pose method includes detailed methodology on using specific drills to increase the perception and control and execution of each of the three elements of running. And this is why the pose method is so elegant. Works. One other study to quote that really kind of says it all, and this has nothing to do with pose again. This is an independent study looking at, what differentiated faster sprinters from slower runs. So let's look at what they're saying. First, more steps lead to faster sprints, and a tiny difference went a long way. Just an extra quarter of step over 2.5 meters differentiated the fastest sprinters. So think of that. More steps. What does that translate to? Higher what? Cadence and what? Not trying to do what? Not trying to increase stride length. Shorter step length led to faster sprints. More steps, shorter step length. There you go. Is that what you thought? Maybe not, right? Maybe not. But this all fits pose perfectly. Whether or not they understand it, the fact is this is something Dr. Romanoff could tell you. He knew this 20 years ago. Torso angle was the next predictor of sprint success. And remember, this study is completely independent. They don't mention pose. They don't talk about it at all. This is them looking at faster sprinters versus slow. Leaning forward just 2 degrees made the extra difference between the slowest and fastest sprinters. Finally, the first step of the sprint was critical. And look what it says here. Look what it says here. The athletes who showed less knee lift in the first step turned in faster sprints. What does that say? Trying to lift the knee higher? Is that positive? Guys, this is independent verification that what Dr. Romanoff is saying, what the pose method is saying, is indeed accurate. Positive and negative transfer. This is an important concept to understand as movement coaches and running coaches. So to get someone to improve, we're typically going to use drills, whether it's a basketball free throw, a tennis backhand, or golf thing, or improving the running, we're going to use drills. What are we trying to do? And this is important to understand. During a drill, we're trying to improve the perception of the person doing the drill of certain elements of the skill. And really more accurately, their kinesthetic or their proprioception, their feel. You don't learn to move cognitively, you learn to move proprioceptively. So drills must improve the person's perception of those elements that you're trying to highlight in a drill. And hopefully there's this improved perception transfers to better actual skill. So when we're looking at a drill, there are three possible outcomes from doing a drill relative to the skill. So if I'm doing a running drill and I'm trying to improve running, or I'm trying to prove, say, the pull, there are three possible outcomes. I do the drill, then I run, and three possible things happen. One, the drill results in improved perception and skill execution. This is called positive transfer in the scientific literature. It does what I want. The person gets better at the skill. The drill helps the skill. Number two possibilities, there's no change in perception and skill. That happens sometimes. I do something, it has no effect, neither negative or positive. The third possibility, and the only possibility, is that the drill actually hurts execution. And this is called negative transfer in the scientific literature. So let's use some examples of positive and negative transfer. So when I'm playing squash actually interferes with the skill of hitting a tennis ball. And I promise you, if you don't know this, talk to anybody who tries to do both in the same time period. It doesn't work. They're close, they're so close, but there's a difference in how the stiffness of the wrist versus a relaxed wrist. And so one actually hurts the other. Another example, using a weighted bat or weighted ball too much will decrease your skill performance with a real bat or ball. That's a fact. It's all in the literature. Okay, that's not going to help you because it's a different neuromuscular patterning, and that doesn't help. So another example is skiers. When we're teaching people to ski, they often try to use their upper body to turn the skis. And when you do that, good instructors will often have them place their poles behind their back through the crook in their elbows. So it's kind of behind your back, makes you kind of stand up straight. And when you do that, it's very difficult and noticeable if you try to rotate the upper body. And rotating the upper body is not the key to turning the ski. So skiers hate this because they feel like they can't ski, but it almost always improves their skill performance by not allowing them to make the error and make them aware of error. So when we want to design an effective drill for anything, we have to, this is how a drill will work if it works. It either does one or all of these things. It either heightens the perception of the mistake, meaning they feel the mistake. If they cannot kinesthetically feel the mistake, they can't control it. And or it does not allow the athlete to make certain mistakes. In the last example, the ski poles, sometimes I do something, I restrict the movement options, which forces the person to do the skill properly. That's also an effective strategy for a drill. And or I exaggerate mistakes so athletes perceive them kinesthetically. Kind of the same thing as the first one. Until the athlete can perceive a movement error, he cannot eliminate it. So we should always ask ourselves and think about what is being transferred by a drill to the actual skill. Negative transfer from treadmill running. So here's a classic example in running. So treadmill running is good, right? Well, let's take a look at why it's not good for the skill of running. The belt is moving at her in this case, right? So what's she going to tend to do because it's moving at her? Well, the fact is she's going to tend to land ahead of the body. It's going to reinforce a heel landing. It's not that you can't forefoot land, but because you're trying and it is functional on a treadmill to decelerate the belt, it helps you. You can use that strategy on a treadmill. That's exactly what we don't want to do in real running. So you are reinforcing and teaching the body neuromuscularly to do something we don't want to do when they run. right? The other thing that we can't do, and this is really crucial to understand on a treadmill, is her body is going to stay straight up and down. If she tries to fall forward as this belt is moving, what's going to happen? She's going to fall on her face. So what she's doing is just moving the legs back and forth. So there's no fall. There's no fall, and we're teaching her to land out. Is that improving running skill? No, it's absolutely detrimental, which is why no great runners run on a treadmill. Now, people also tend to extend the stride in the treadmill and slow their cadence because that works on a treadmill, where we know in the real world, in real running, it doesn't work. So let's look at another option, which is called sproing. Sproing is a soft surface running device. So they're tethered from the rear. Notice they're on a soft surface, and they're tethered. So what does this do? Well, let's look at the three elements of running and how utilizing this device for drills can actually improve running skills potentially. First of all, when we look at the pose or mid stance, and both of these runners are in the pose, right? They're in the pose. Because the surface is soft, this is going to force them to become more aware and improve their perception of their body position and improve their stability challenge, and it's going to cause them to focus more and become more skilled at executing the pose. Is that a good thing? That's exactly what we want, right? We want improved awareness of body position in the pose because getting into that position is so important. Fall. Because they are restrained from the rear, they fall, they literally can fall into the belt. This allows the trainer to coach the athlete, and if they try to bend forward at the waist, I can see it, and I can coach them. Keep the body in alignment. And it also allows me to emphasize a very high fall angle, which is to say to overemphasize it so that the athlete begins to be aware of, perceive it, which is the first step to them being able to manipulate fall angle on command effectively. They have to be kinesthetically aware of it. Pull. Because this soft surface, the athlete must pull harder to get the foot from the surface. It's like putting your foot in sand. It requires more effort and more strength to pull the foot. So we're going to get a positive transfer from sproing to running rather than a negative transfer. So sproing is going to eliminate many bad negative running habits. So let's go through this. We're going to landing with the foot in front of the body and worse yet on the heel. When you're using sproing, as per the previous pictures, you simply can't do it. You cannot land on the heel, and you can't land with it's hard to land with a foot in front of the body. What does this mean? That mistake is just gone. We're not reinforcing it. Overstriding. There is no striding ahead of the body. You can't do it. So again, there's just simply the athlete cannot make that mistake. Cadence too slow. So when you're using sproing, there's a sensor that picks up your cadence and translates that into miles per hour movement speed. So your speed is directly related to cadence when you train on a sproing. As a result, if you want to run faster, there's only one way. What is that? To increase your cadence. So what you find as a coach when you coach people to run on sproing is their cadence tends to naturally increase. Is that a good thing in general? Yes. Why is it a good thing? We know that most runners do what? They have too slow a cadence. Big one, bullet 4, failure to full body lean, fall, and a tendency to bend forward at the waist. That's a huge error in running. This error usually occurs because of an unconscious fear of falling. Sproing allows a person to feel completely safe while doing a full body lean and fall, and it is very easy to see and correct a person if they're flexing at the waist. So we can get rid of that bad habit. Inappropriate arm swing, such as extending and flexing the elbow while running. If I'm doing that, what am I doing? I'm creating a longer lever. It slows me down. Not the primary factor, but a factor. How easy is that to see and coach on sproing? You're standing right there. It's very easy. Runner trying to push into the ground and driving the knee up and forward with hip flexors. If you're trained to see this, you can see the difference immediately between driving the knee versus pulling the heel directly under the hip, and you can coach them to do this properly while they're running. So an important thing to understand is sproing is never going to replace running. If you want to run effectively, you need to spend time running. Absolutely need to do running. And you need to do some running drills either outside or in a large enough area to actually run. So nothing replaces running. Just like riding any form of stationary bike or putting your bike on any form of indoor trainer does not replace training outside on a bike. But the question when you're training someone inside is, what are your choices? Your choices really come down to a treadmill or spring. And I hope what you can see from this little exercise is the spring is a much better choice for a lot of reasons to train the person on the spring. And by the way, they have half the impact. That doesn't hurt either, right? Coaching running on spring. So when we want to coach someone to run on spring, you're going to hook them up either using the harness or the belt, and you're going to get them into a forward full body lean. Make sure they're straight with no bend at the waist. You're going to start them walking, then marching. You exaggerate the arm swing to make them get in sync, then jog, then run. You're going to face the client, and you can mirror yourself on the floor what you want the person to do in the cadence. Ensure that the person maintains a full body lean. Have them go faster and slower while you're watching their speed and cadence to see, and so that they begin to feel the difference and feel what a brisk cadence should feel like. If arms move with legs as opposed to in opposition, which we call the camel, because that's how camel walk, tell the person to relax the arms at side and march or jog without focusing on the arm swing. And if they relax, what will happen is their shoulders and arms will naturally begin to swing in the pattern of opposition, because it is natural to human beings unless they're severely neurologically damaged. Also, look for knee drive. People want to drive the knee forward. In the picture there, she's not driving the knee forward. You'll notice that the foot is in line with the leg, which means she's pulling the foot under the hip. Now, when she pulls the foot under the hip, the knee flexes, but there's a difference between pulling and driving the knee. And if you just play with it, you'll see it immediately. So rate of perceived exertion initially is going to be higher on here because it's new and it's a new motor pattern. But the rate of perceived exertion will drop with time and practice. Remember, all runners tend to improve with higher speed and cadence, so make sure they get to a nice brisk pace without doing a super high heel lift to avoid fatigue. And the other thing to remember, this is the last bullet in bold, is most important. As with all skill work, it's essential to training an interval training pattern, avoiding fatigue and allowing lots of recovery between drills and efforts when working on the skill remark. Remember, this is not conditioning we're working on. This is skill, and you can't improve skill and learn neurologically when you're tired. Train tired, and you'll run sloppy, and running sloppy reinforces bad technique.